So hi everybody, my name's Ethan Zuckerman. I direct a research lab called the Center for Civic Media over at MIT's Media Lab. I am lucky enough to be leading this panel, which I think should be quite fascinating, on new ideas around digital and real communities. Before I get started, let me just thank John, thank Sonia for bringing us here today for what's been a very stimulating conversation so far. We're now going to move a little bit into this territory of how do we think about the current state of democracy, this possibility of crisis in democracy, not just in terms of civil society and political parties, which we generally tend to think of as actors within this space, but with this group, we're going to bring technology and bring digital communities into the mix. And this is something that I think almost everyone who works in politics, who works in social change, has been seeing over the last few years. Social media in particular has proven to be a remarkably powerful and sometimes quite disruptive political force. Now, there's actually a long history of people trying to make political and social change and to strengthen democracy through technology. But I have bad news for you, which is not only is democracy in crisis, but this notion of using tech for social change, that's in crisis too. And that's in crisis because we are roughly 20 years in to what we might call the cyber utopian project. So when the internet rises to public visibility in the mid-1990s, there's an enormous number of people who say, this is great, this is going to change politics forever, it's going to be far more participatory, you're going to be able to hear individual voices, political parties are going to disappear, we won't need them anymore, there are going to be other ways to organize, you're going to have direct voting, you're going to have direct democracy. That hasn't gone so well, guys. It's turned out that bringing the internet and bringing widespread ubiquitous technology into politics has had a number of effects, but they've had much more to do with strengthening existing parties and in some ways revealing existing weaknesses and frameworks. In the United States, and I'm going to draw on my background in the United States, there was this enormous amount of enthusiasm in the candidacy of Vermont Governor Howard Dean, who ran for president, because suddenly in the year 2000, there was all this notion that perhaps individuals could be involved with writing the platform, with putting specific suggestions up. Once we went 4 years later, 8 years later, 12, 16 years later, no one seriously suggests that political platforms in the US are going to get written online. In fact, what online has mostly become is an excellent way to do targeted mailings and to raise money. To the point where my friend Nico Mele, who teaches at the Kennedy School, runs a class on online politics where he basically says on the first day, online politics is really simple. Get an email list, ask everyone on the email list for money, repeat. And then he dismisses the class. It's great. It's very straightforward. But these experiments with bringing online deliberation and hoping to have more civility have largely led people to deliberating in offline spaces where we can actually see each other because the offline spaces proved to be so challenging. Many of us had hoped that the internet would provide an open platform for publishing so that you could hear people posting their manifestos, building alternative media, and that certainly has had an effect, particularly in closed societies. We're seeing in a lot of closed parts of the world that if the media is controlled by the state, it's incredibly important that you have access to online spaces. So in a country like Turkey, you may be in circumstances where the TV has really been captured by pro-Erdogan forces, but you do have alternative voices online. The bad news with this is that those alternative voices are predominantly on platforms like Facebook, and they have, in their own way, become very politically powerful and have become gatekeepers for speech. So people like me who 20 years ago were incredibly excited that we were going to transform democracy through technology are actually pretty severely depressed. And so when you come into a room like this, where we've been talking about the challenges with electoral democracy, we've been talking about different flavors of authoritarianism, I'm supposed to come here and bring technology into the mix and make everything feel better. And frankly, I'm in a state of existential crisis, wondering whether tech is actually going to improve this situation or not. Thank goodness we have 3 other people here on the panel who are not as depressed, not as negative, and frankly are just more creative and more interesting about this topic than I. So just going from my left, we have Professor Stefania Milan. I've just done that very badly. Professor Stefania Milan from the University of Amsterdam. She teaches in the New Media and Digital Culture department there, does an enormous amount of work on a critical look at big data, and looking at big data not necessarily from the marketing perspective of how do we find out everything about everyone, but really looking at it from activist perspectives. Immediately to my left, we have Pedro Abramovay, who I have the good fortune to work with at Open Society Foundations, where he leads our Latin America program. But prior to that work, and in that work, Pedro, in fact, has become one of the fiercest advocates within Open Society for the idea that digital technologies can make politics more participatory. And he really roots this in his own experience within the Brazilian government, where he's been involved with an incredibly successful experiment in authoring legislation online. To my right is my friend and colleague Chelsea Barabas, who works with me at the MIT Media Lab. At the moment, she leads really the social change and outreach component of a project called the Digital Currency Initiative, which is basically the MIT Media Lab's look at whether we can use Bitcoin and the blockchain in ways that are pro-social, make change around the world. Much of her experience is in countries like Kenya, where she looks very critically at whether the assumptions we make about these new technologies are going to lead to a more progressive future. But she's got expertise in a wide range of areas, including on diversity within the new digital economy, which she wrote a brilliant thesis about, which I happen to know since I had advised it. So having stacked the deck with people that I really enjoy spending some time with, I'm going to start with Stefania, and we're going to go with the conversation from there.
Thank you very much for a kind introduction. And well, I also want to start thanking the organizers of this event. I've been teaching for a short while at this university. I don't even remember how many years ago. I just know that last week I met 2 of my master's students who had just now finished their PhD. So a few years back, so I'm very happy to be back here. Thank you very much. I have taken seriously the invitation by Professor John Shattuck this morning of being innovative, optimistic. Not last because I come from Amsterdam, and I'm very excited to be in a city which is actually so sunny and summerish. So, I'm going to share with you some of my current work that I'm conducting in Amsterdam with a team of 10 people. Thanks to a starting grant of the European Research Council that looks at the politics of big data. But I tell you, I would like to start from sharing where I come from. So I'm interested in grassroots engagement with technology. I do not look at Facebook, I do not look at, let's say mainstream platforms, but I look at what people do with technology when they want to create their own platforms, their own infrastructures. So I spend a lot of time with hackers, grassroots technologists, and so on and so forth. So really the creators of code and infrastructure. Something that, has been historically relatively marginal, if you want, golden niche that didn't much escalate to the rest of the social movement ecosystem. But I do see some change there. So from this perspective, I look now at what datafication, if you want, or big data or massive data collection affords for politics, for grassroots and emancipatory politics. But I would like actually to go back a little bit and reflect again on the mistrust that citizens have now for institutions and the processes and mechanism of democratic governance. We have heard from the previous panel the problems with voting, and the lack of civic engagement at that level by both old and younger generations. There's an aspect that hasn't been explored yet, which is the blanket monitoring and surveillance of citizens by the surveillance complex made up of the state and the industry. It's what Shoshana Zuboff called a surveillance capitalism. And let's face it, we live in it, we are all subject to it. Edward Snowden might have helped us realize the extent of the problem, but there's certainly much more that bubbles under the surface that we are not even aware of, not even our worst nightmares. And this has certainly curbing effects on democratic participation, and certainly on the trust that citizens hold for institutions. And I see this as a fundamental element in the current crisis of democratic institutions. Might be more or less explicit, citizens might more or less engage with it, discuss it, but it is something that we are going to see is going to play a big role also in the coming decades. But I promise to be optimistic. So, what is optimistic in datification and in massive monitoring of citizens? Well, I try to focus on the good dynamics that datification triggers. And the thesis, the argument that I want to share with you today is a little bit provocative, 10 minutes, just try to say something that sticks with you, and I'm going to gloss over some definitions, so bear with me in this exercise. But what I want to argue is that emerging data cultures and practices, which are very much rooted in technology, but not only, which arise from the grassroots, have the ability to revitalize civic participation and transform citizenship as we know it. Now, it's a bit of a big claim. Let's assume I'm not a political scientist for now. Let's not discuss what citizenship is in practice. But I want to focus on the ways of appropriating big data, for example, by means of resisting massive data collection or subverting it or appropriating data, as they reshape the relation between citizens and institutions. So it is really what I see quite interesting democratic innovation and a form of citizen empowerment. It's not as widespread as I would like it to be, but I think there's some hope for the future. Now, to look at this phenomenon, I use sort of a heuristic tool, the notion of data activism. It's a theoretical construct. I've met so far very few people who actually describe themselves as the data activist. But there's a lot of people that actually use information in the form of statistics, but not only in order to produce social change. So what is data activism? And by the way, I don't have any empirical evidence for this. I just started working on a 5-year grant, so maybe in 5 years' time I'm going to have something to back up what is so far an intuition. But it was a sufficient intuition to convince the funders to give me the money. So there must be some truth in there. So data activism, as I said, a heuristic tool to think politically about big data and activism, civic engagement. It's a broad phenomenon. Let's say it identifies all the grassroots social technical practices that are concerned with a critical approach to big data. Let's not define critical, but I guess you know what I mean. Now, data activists address massive data collection as both a challenge to civic rights. So, of course, we're thinking about the surveillance part, but also a novel set of opportunities for social change. And here, with data activism, I also want to intersect all those that use data and data visualization and so on for advocacy and social change. Data activism is rooted, it's enabled, but also, of course, constrained by software. And it emerges from hacker and open source movements and other similar subcultures, but tries to overcome their elitist character, trying to also spread to the layman, if you want, lay women. Some examples. Well, there's plenty of examples from more or less all over the world, but let's pick on a couple. You might remember the Haiti earthquake. Lots of people died. Also, communications were extremely difficult at first, in particular, lack of electricity, but lack of information to coordinate efficient disaster relief operation. Well, there's a number of people in the U.S. started there, but a network, but became very quickly a network of crisis mappers, something now also used by the United Nations. but it was sort of relatively novel back then, that started plotting on a map, on an online maps, on a software called Ushahidi that have been created actually somewhere else in the world, in Africa, for electoral monitoring, but it's a mapping software. So they used a script that allowed people to text, so an SMS, not even your smartphone, nothing of that kind, some basic technology, and text their location, their needs, reports about the situation. All these data were plotted on a map. The result was that pretty quickly over 40,000 eyewitness accounts were submitted to this platform, and this proved vital to help these people in need. So this is one example of what I call data activism. But another example could be Open Spending, which is a platform that gathers all the open data on public spending in, I think, over 90 countries right now in the world, and allows everyone with knowledge or not about the topic to browse and compare and look for discrepancies or whatever, for advocacy or simply for information. We also have civic hackers who try to use information and data to help improving the output of the state. But also, for example, crypto parties that are trying to bring closer to the layman the practices of cryptography, so that it is no longer just something for the technically minded amongst us. And yes, of course, this intersects very much the realm of technical practice, which of course is not available yet to everyone. But as I said, I think that's at least my thesis. These people are actually actively trying to move beyond the realm of hacking communities and speak more and more to ordinary users. Now, to conclude, what's new? Well, this is a phenomenon that, of course, emerges in the fringes of what we have called the liberal democracy. So it doesn't emerge in the mainstream. But, and this is what it makes a difference from hacking of the early days, these people do not seek to remain isolated, nor they just want to operate in the realm of prefigurative politics here, there, and there, little niche. What they try to do, they try to influence also the institutional level, for example, trying to ameliorate state output. Just to mention one. In what does data activism constitute a democratic innovation? In a way, where's the good news in data activism? Well, these emerging data cultures and practices, which are rooted in everyday technology, I mean, the software is very easy to use, technology like a mobile phone that everyone has right in his or her pocket, well, they have the ability to alter the way people enact their democratic agency. What do I mean? It becomes data activism expands and multiplies spaces of opportunities for political action. So you do not speak to your policymaker only in occasion of, for example, voting, once every, 4 or 5 years, but you try to change whatever doesn't work in your society, in your community, by providing direct input to the state. So it becomes a recursive exercise of civic engagement that, on the one level, you can actually do it at home, on your sofa, whatever, collectively or individually. But at the same time, it's also something that you can do that speaks directly to policymakers that are more or less willing to listen. At least they're willing to listen right now because it is still something new and something cool. So, and here I really conclude by expanding and multiplying the spaces and opportunities for political action. I believe that data activism in the long run might represent a redefinition, an instance of redefinition of citizenship as we know it, where citizenship becomes a politics of the quotidian. It's something that you practice every day in your community as opposed to something that you activate only every now and then. Thank you very much for your attention.
Stefania. But clapping's a good response. It was better than jumping in with a question, which is what I'm now going to do. So I'm very curious. You frame this emergence of surveillant capital and surveillant society as sort of a fact of life that we're living within right now. And there's certainly a very strong argument to be made that most of what's happening in online spaces is supported by a surveillant economy, one that's worth trillions of dollars and has armies of researchers sort of grabbing and analyzing this data. What are reasonable, feasible techniques to resist in that space? Given the incredible intellectual and fiscal firepower being put to work both by governments and by commercial firms seeking to use surveillance to identify either customers or bad actors of one flavor or another. Where do you see the space for resistance within this? Because you clearly see that ability to have the technology in your hand and the ability for someone to participate at home as a way of trying to level that playing field.
Well, this is a big question, but one that with my research team we spend a lot of time thinking about. In fact, if you ever come to Amsterdam in our sort of lab space, what you see is not really very optimistic people. I mean, I was playing here the optimist, but we are mostly concerned with surveillance, and also the people that I hired come from that experience.
The good news is after Brexit, we're actually all going to be in Amsterdam.
Oh, well, if you like the rain, you're very welcome. How to resist? So we are trying to understand exactly how to do that, and we don't have empirical data yet, but we have identified a number of groups that we would like to work with in order to really empirically investigate this question of how do you resist in that space. Probably an easy way out now would be to say that it's also a question for us academics. How do we academics resist that part? And I can tell you that we are built an entire autonomous infrastructure of internal communication, storage of data, and all of that. And it is not particularly easy, but it has kept us busy for probably the first 6 months of the project, and it's also quite expensive, by the way. So in a way, I think what is important is to first of all work on the awareness raising part of it. So try to understand that yes, it is probably a fact of life, but yes, it is wrong. So it's not that because it's a fact of life that we should turn a blind eye to it. And that's what we're trying to do also as advocates, although we are, of course, academics first.
Thank you so much. I want to hand this over at this point to Pedro Abramovay, who I know is suffering a bit from a cold, so we're going to put the mic right up close next to him.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Ethan. Thank you very much, John, for the invitation, Stefania, for helping. It's really a pleasure for me to be here. Not exactly as I normally come here at Budapest as the Latin America director for Latin America Open Society, and here I'm coming much more with the hat of some of the academic research I'm doing and the work of participating in the government. Sorry for my voice. I'll try to use my bossa nova singer abilities to use the mic, speak low and use the mic to reach you. If you're not getting to hear me, please say and we'll try to do some other types of communication. So I'm here to tell a story about a project that went really well, in fact, which is, I think, if there is bringing optimism. And probably it went well because we didn't know that, the outcome of the relationship of technology and democracy was going to be so dark, I would say, in the sense, right? It was, and so it is a story of, in 2014, Brazil, the Brazilian Congress, which is a very conservative Congress, approved a bill of that we call in Portuguese Marco Civil da Internet, just legal framework of the Internet, but some of us just call the Bill of Rights of Internet, because it's a legal framework that recognizes right to privacy, freedom of expression, and it includes the human rights agenda into the Internet framework, and also recognize net neutrality as an outcome of this. And it was, for example, before the net neutrality recognition in the US. And so how come the Brazilian Congress approved this law with a lot of congressmen that were funded by telecom communications and in an environment that clearly wasn't propitious in the Congress to approve. So my hypothesis is that the process of drafting this legislation allowed us to approve this law. And so I'll come back some years and try to explain how this piece of legislation was born. So in 2008, there was a very, very complicated project in the Congress that was aligned with many of the projects that were being discussed all around the world. In fact, that gained some popularity afterwards, which was SOPA, PIPA, projects that would criminalize internet users, connecting the intellectual property protection with the ability of the police to get information from people and surveillance. And so way before, I would say, way before the NSA scandal, way before this was something that was being discussed. I entered in this debate because I was at the time Secretary for Legislative Affairs at the Ministry of Justice, which in Brazil is Justice and Interior, so responsible for all the criminal justice and criminal procedures and penalties reform in the Congress from the executive perspective. And so our goal there was just trying to stop those absurd penalties and crimes that were being invented against internet users at the time. I had no previous connection with what we call now as the surveillance or the data activist movement that already existed in Brazil, but clearly that was not my connection. But it was really hard in the Congress to push back that because there was a big push from the bankers, from the banks, saying that, because of frauds and we needed more aggressive internet fraud law, a big push from the entertainment sector, a big push from the police, a big push from foreign affairs because they wanted to sign the Budapest Convention, which was really a big trend at the moment. So it was really hard for us. And then there was a reaction that started from civil society, from activists that would come from the free software movement that was seen as a big threat, but connected also, and this is really interesting, with game users, right? Video game and computer game users, because they were able to tell to those people that this would affect the environment they were playing and using the internet. So that generated a big reaction to Parliament. It was the beginning of online mobilization. The Parliament took that on serious. It was, wow, I'm receiving a lot of emails, petitions, hundreds of thousands of signatures. So it blocked a little bit the discussion, but it wasn't enough power. But suddenly there was an event, a free software event in Brazil, in Porto Alegre, city in the south of Brazil, and President Lula attended to it. And there was big demonstrations against the project there, right? This bill that was being called, they were just doing the parallel with a very, very aggressive bill from the dictatorship and saying that it was the dictatorship that was coming back in the internet. And so, and this movement was calling for a civil legal framework. So we shouldn't start regulating the internet by the criminal side. We should start by the civil side. And they asked that, and then suddenly Lula, who was briefed just before, he announced that the government was going to propose this civil legal framework, and that the criminal process would be blocked at least for a while from the government perspective. And he said that the Ministry of Justice was going to be responsible for it, which was key because if it was the communications ministry, they were all captured by the telecommunications. And so it was my responsibility to start it. And normally what we would have done, we would just, talk to some specialists, talk to the sectors, to the lobbyists, and, civil society, do some meetings, and draft a project and send to Congress. Could maybe open it before, just to receive some comments. But partly because I was willing to do that for a while before in the ministry, and partly because I didn't have because it was the Ministry of Justice, we didn't have the expertise to do it. We decided to do a completely open process to draft the legislation. So we just put 10 principles that came from, I want to explain exactly where it came from because I don't have time for it, but we laid out 10 principles and we opened the principles for discussion. People could comment on them. And after the first round of discussion, we presented the first draft and opened each paragraph and each paragraph of this for a public debate online. And people came and commented in a way that was really interesting. Of course, people who commented first were basically the civil society, right? And the other actors, they would ask me for a meeting. And so what we did is that we're not doing private meetings on that. We're just receiving the public communication. One of the Association of Internet Providers, they just sent to my email their position, and we just posted it as if they have just and then they were forced to go to the debate. So what happened then is it was a very polarized environment with internet providers, the banks, the federal police, the civil society, and in Congress they were all against each other. And through this process, they were able to build a consensus by multiple. So we then redraft and sent another version. It was public, and after 1 year of discussion, there was clearly a support from those different sides. And I have some hypotheses of why this happened. The first hypothesis is there was no vote. And in fact, at the same time, there was another project that around the same issues, which was intellectual property bill, that was put to public consultation, but they had votes. You did the comments, and then you had to like or not. And then there was, of course, robots, and there was, they had much more participation than ours, much more in numbers of, but the process created a lot of polarization, increased the polarization, and not, in our case, it clearly decreased the polarization. And I did some interview with the actors afterward, and everybody agrees, the different actors agrees with that. The only actor who didn't participate in this process was the telecommunication company. They weren't part. They said, we have the Congress, right? We buy them, right? So it's easy. And so what happened is when the bill arrives in the Congress, first of all, the Congress decided to do a similar process and open again for the same kind of consultation because they wanted to connect with. And there was a real polarization, but then again, with an alliance that was built from the internet process and the telecommunication. And what we saw is that the partners that sometimes received the incentives, mainly from the telecommunications, to break the alliance, so they would come to entertainment industry and say, you should be against it because, and they tried to block the alliance, and of course, everything was dismantled. When they remained with the consensus that was built before, the process advanced sometimes. So, but then there was a major event that was the NSA, disclosure, and then after that, the executive branch put this as a big priority. So, and then it began to move, and of course, you could say, well, but then the executive is really the drive, the force that can drive it. But the main priority for the executive was to create local data centers in Brazil where all the emails from Google and everything should be stored in Brazil as if it was possible. And that broke the agreement with the rest of the alliance, right? And then the rest of the alliance, of course, said, no, then we won't approve this, right? And the government lost that. And then the government also had to come back to the original point together with the alliance, and the process was finally approved against all the lobby of the telecommunications. So I think that's, of course, there's a lot of afterwards, but I think the story is, it's clear for everybody that is involved. If you ask, I've interviewed parliamentarians, lobbyists and all that the process affected the way the discussion arrived in Congress. Right?
So, Pedro, it's wonderful to get this story. This story of Marco Civil to Internet has become sort of one of the key chapters when we talk about the possibility of technology making democracy more inclusive, more participatory, because this is a very large piece of legislation. It's extremely important. It had widespread participation. At the same time, hearing you tell the story as an insider, for me, it's very much a reminder that the hard problems are techno-social problems, sure. Which is to say they're almost never a matter of just bringing in the technical solution. You refer to this other bill where they brought in perhaps a more sophisticated platform. This succeeded because you had a bunch of social factors. You were one of those social factors. It was important that there was someone in Ministry of Justice working on this. You had the good luck of Lula coming to this conference, seeing the protesters, getting on board with it. You had the great luck of, Snowden revealing the NSA surveillance, the wonderful luck of my country's deep interest in the ongoing affairs within Brazil. Thank you very much. So given the intersection of all these factors that made it possible for this to happen, and one that you and I have talked about a little bit before, which is this is a really geeky piece of legislation. And the people who got involved were computer geeks. What would you advise governments that are looking for meaningful online participation but not around internet legislation? Take another issue of your choice, take a government of your choice. How could they have a Marco Civil, whatever we want, and have it have some of the successes you had here?
Sure. I think, first of all, there are some other factors that I think we should remind on this. There was a civic mobilization before, right? So the government didn't invent it, the civic mobilization, and wasn't trying to create from the state the civic mobilization around the issue, right? There were a group of people already interested and mobilized around it. I think that was key, and I think that's key for any issue. When the government tries to just, say you should participate on that, I think it's not possible. The other thing is, when we try to use online participation as a quantitative, way to approach democracy, right? Normally it doesn't work, right? Because it's not about having 1 million or 2 million for one side, 1 million for the other. It's much more, and I think most of the experiences of online participation have gone on that direction. How can we increase the number of participants, right? And the point that we clearly did with this process is we had all the arguments present in society were listened for real in this process, right? That wouldn't be a lot of the arguments in a traditional process, open, on closed doors, when they wouldn't reach power if there wasn't the open process. So I think what's interesting here is you can confront all the arguments that are present in society with this process, and that's really good, and you can make a good use of that, right? If you do it right. If you just try to replace elections and replace evaluations of people's choice by using that, normally you won't, because then it will increase polarization. You won't form alliance, and probably elections are still the best way to do that if it's just the candidate.
It feels like there's almost a dirty little secret in here, which is we want more participation, we want more voices, but frankly, even in a digital age, we don't have terrific tools to deal with massive participation. You're almost suggesting that the success of this was that you had modest participation, but you had a great breadth of participation, which got you enough of a mix that it ended up working.
Yeah, I think so. I think of course you should always be worried by who has access to, right? Who has access to the ability of formulate an idea and group of interest. So I think this is a key thing. But I think if you think you can again manage to confront in an equal perspective the different arguments from society, I think you are increasing the quality of the deliberative process that you already had. You're not trying to replace it,
Yeah.
but I think you're increasing the quality of the process.
Thanks so much, Pedro. And that feels like a really helpful clue for anyone who's thinking about the future of deliberation. So I'm going to turn over to my colleague Chelsea, who I will sort of disclaim is doing something fairly brave in that she's going to talk about a very interesting but very contemporary phenomenon, actually something that's just been unfolding in the last couple of weeks. And while it is absolutely around questions of democratic practice, it looks less like democratic practice than what Pedro just talked about. So you're going to have to take my word for it at the beginning of this, that what she's about to talk about is sort of the cutting edge of where people are looking to this new technology of the blockchain as a space for building self-governing and self-monitoring systems. So, disclaimers ahead, Chelsea Barabas.
Okay, thanks, Ethan. And thank you guys, because it's been a really long day of listening. And so I'm going to try to keep this as interesting as possible and not get into technical weeds. A big part of the reason that I'm really interested in this work actually is because I think it's fascinating in a lot of different ways. One of them is it's a very interesting social movement with a lot of very smart, very kooky, very talented people with very particular worldviews. And I'm going to try to share some of that with you today. So the social movement, and this is actually my first time characterizing it as a social movement. I was reflecting on that earlier today, and I do think this is a growing social movement that we're looking at, is really, I think, very kind of acutely in touch with, I think, the situation that Ethan was kind of describing at the very beginning of this, which is that this dream of technology playing a transformative role in kind of revitalizing our civic lives has very much failed, and for a few particular reasons. One is that a lot of the really early moving kind of disruptive looking platforms and companies that we saw 15 to 20 years ago have become the new incumbent big players. Google, Facebook, these types of platforms are really kind of extending their reach and influence in ways that we haven't really seen before, both kind of quantitatively and qualitatively, in terms of the types of influence they're able to have. But then also, as is kind of the standard story of, how innovative new things end up panning out in the future, the institutions and people who have been able to benefit the most from things like the internet, the web, are arguably the people who are already in power. So if you're already well positioned to be able to kind of take and extract value from new technologies, you're probably going to be able to do that in ways that other more grassroots people might not be able to do. This community, I guess, is centered around this idea. I guess the best known faction of them are working on a project called Bitcoin. And a big focus in the work that they're doing is around this idea of decentralization. So this idea of we want to be able to take critical kind of tasks and processes that we all kind of collectively benefit from, such as being able to pay each other digitally with a credit card or whatever, and offload that from being something that is managed by large kind of institutional players like banks, to being something that we can kind of collectively maintain together. So can we come up with a shared set of rules and a set of rewards and punishments that kind of incentivize us to cooperate together to get this task done? So Bitcoin's specific mission within that was around digital payments. Can we offload this task of kind of updating accounts, transferring money from one person to another, from our formal financial institution to a community, an open community of people who can kind of maintain that procedure for us? Bitcoin's the best known kind of community. Is everybody here familiar kind of at least with kind of the name Bitcoin? Okay. How about Ethereum? So it's a lot less known. I'm deep in the rabbit hole, so I feel like everybody knows about everything. So, but Ethereum is another community that's really been growing up in the last couple of years. So Bitcoin is about 6 years old. Ethereum is 2 years old. But recently, specifically in the last year or so, they've really started, I think, attracting actually a much larger community of developers and social activists. And they have a much broader kind of goal than the Bitcoin community's goal, which is much more generally around this idea of collective governance. So for them, their idea is, okay, can we create some sort of shared digital space where we can start to develop ways of automating certain governance tasks that we need to do. And the key to this space that they want to create digitally is that it's secure and that it's transparent. So the idea is that anybody should be able to go to this space, look at what's going on, and make sure that whatever procedures or protocols you're trying to kind of outline are running according to plan. So to make that more concrete, I'll give you a specific example. For example, a lot of people are talking about, the challenge that folks like Hernando de Soto, who's a Peruvian economist, have been talking about for several decades, which is in several countries around the world, one of the biggest hindrances to being able to register land or register a new business, and thus kind of formalizing ownership and kind of, developing an economy towards more formalized institutions is a big barrier to that is actually the tedious and bureaucratic process of having to go through several different ministries and steps in order to make that land title kind of an official thing. It opens up opportunities for rent seeking, and generally it proves to be more expensive than it's worth to do. So folks are saying, okay, could we not? There are reasons we have procedures. There are, we have to do due diligence to make sure we don't, double record ownership of a piece of land, things like that. So there are things we need to do. There is a process that we need to follow. But could that process be automated and delineated in code? Could we say, if this person can establish this set of documents, then they receive this designation in our system? Can we do that in a way that enables us to kind of take away all the messiness of our social institutions, of having real people be the people we have to interface with, and streamline it so it's much more efficient and much more fair and auditable in a way that it isn't currently. In some ways, what these guys are doing is kind of like the ultimate story of nerds saving the world. Like, they think we can save the world by via better information processing procedures, right? It's super unsexy, data management, thinking about how we're gonna, run code for these pretty bureaucratic tasks. But I think they are really onto something in that increasingly issues of information management, data flows, algorithms are becoming kind of the new bedrock of a lot of our decision-making apparatuses, both within government and outside. So some of my prior work was also looking at, the increasing kind of rise of automated hiring and recruitment practices using data to assess people's potential for a job. There's a lot of conversation going on in the States right now about the role of data and algorithms in how people are sentenced once they've been I can't remember the word right now. What is it when you've committed a crime? Once you've been convicted of a crime, really trying to think about and starting to kind of question this notion that things that are data-driven are neutral and objective. Really starting to ask these questions about how do biases and kind of power dynamics external to the code we write come to influence the code we have. So in that very general sense, I think these guys are onto something. There are things we need to be able, there are thoughtful things we can start to do to think about checks and balances and transparency and auditability of these processes that don't currently exist today. On the other hand, I think we have a long way to go, and this is a very early phase of this work. And I think that's best illustrated by one of the biggest and kind of, I guess, now most well-known experiments that's happened over the last month or so that I'll tell you about now. It was a project called the DAO. DAO is an acronym for Distributed Autonomous Organization. It's a project that was built on Ethereum Ethereum is this, Ethereum, the crux of their work is trying to create this neutral computational environment I was talking about before where you could run code. And the goal of the DAO was basically kind of a cross between a crowdfunding platform and a venture capital firm. So the idea was that anybody could join this. All you had to do was basically become an investor in the organization. So you could buy shares into the DAO. And if you bought shares, then you had the right to vote on a set of proposals coming through. Actually, very much similar to, I think, the video we watched Aula earlier. There's a process for proposing projects that could happen, and then the members of this organization can vote on what they want to fund. Very democratic kind of ideals underlying this idea that, we can have these voting processes, we want to harness the wisdom of the crowd to make better decisions about investment and things like that. The thing is, that entire process of voting and selecting things was contained within a set of code. And I don't know how many people in here have ever written code or know much about it, but I mean, code in general is a pretty rigid and you have to be pretty, it will only do exactly what you tell it to do. So if there are any kind of loopholes or, holes in the system, those can be exploited. Those are called bugs, and bugs are in software all the time. And in fact, as this thing started to grow, there was growing kind of concern that, hey, maybe this is going to be a little too rigid at this stage for us to really do this in a responsible way. So interest grew. This DAO started about a month ago, opened up for people to join, and within 2 weeks, about $200 million had been invested in it. 2 weeks ago, two of the chief architects of the DAO actually wrote a public letter saying, listen, I think we need to place a moratorium on proposals for for investment. We've done some audits of what we're doing, and we're seeing some pretty serious attack vectors that people could start to exploit. But unfortunately, that call for a moratorium came it was too little too late. What happened was on Thursday, this last week, within a couple of hours, about $50 million. Actually, we're not exactly sure how much right now. It's $20 to $50 million worth of investment from this organization was siphoned off using one of the exploits that they were afraid was going to happen. So right now, the folks who are running this are in this really interesting kind of position because they, want to be able to protect the interests of the people who have invested in the project, but on the other hand, in order to protect their interests, they might have to compromise some of the key ideals that they're trying to preserve right now around creating a sacred space where you don't stop things, you can't have somebody intervene from the top down to make bad things stop happening. So long story short, the dream of the DAO has come crashing down very quickly. And I think the key weakness of this, or the key inclination that I think this community is still getting wrong is that they still have this urge to offload all of the messiness and the complexity of the real world and our messy social institutions into this neutral, kind of sterile environment. And I think that inclination is just impossible to achieve. On the other hand, though, I do think that some of the general kind of goals that this community is trying to achieve are very interesting. In particular, I think, thinking about creating shared infrastructures for large-scale cooperation and collaboration is really interesting. I think we can learn from kind of the early hopes we had of that with the web and kind of build from that. And then also this idea about the importance of transparency and checks and balances on data-driven decision-making moving forward. These are really important things that I think they're going to keep working on. The key thing we need to just come to terms with is this idea that there is no such thing as an autonomous organization. If you try to say something is autonomous and neutral, you're just rendering invisible the people who are actually behind the scenes pulling the strings. So I'll stop there. Yeah.
So we could clap, and then I'm going to ask Chelsea questions. But so Chelsea, just because this literally happened in the last week, and I've pretty much been in a boardroom that entire time, I just want to make sure that I understand fully sort of what's going on here. Mm. The Ethereum community decided that they would build a new type of structure No one was in charge of it. No one's the boss. No one's the CEO. No one's the managing director. Instead, there's a set of code that says, this is how we will take in investments. This is how we decide what to invest in, and then we're going to distribute the money.
Yes.
And this, in many ways, this is a nerd dream, right? So rather than like sitting in a room arguing with Pedro and Chris about what open society should do, in Latin America, instead there's just a code set that I can look at, and suddenly we know how all the investments are going to happen. They're simply going to happen through execution of that
And
code.
it's transparent and you can't corrupt it. Yes.
And then the people who wrote this code at a certain point stood up and said, by the way, I think we probably don't have this right. And then as sort of an object lesson in them not having it right, someone used one of those bugs they suggested might be in there to siphon off a quarter of the investment fund, which happened to be $50 million. Okay, just want to make sure that I had this. So now that I understand why this makes sense in a conversation about democracy, is this the product of a system that is 3 years old, it's buggy, it's just getting started, eventually we're going to shake the bugs out of this, and then the idea of an organization that's governable via a code-based rule set could work, could be viable, could be in fact powerful and transformative, could make it so that people who are trying to get land title in my adopted country of Ghana, something that I've been trying to do on my pepper farm for 12 years now, might be able to do this in a predictable fashion by following a set of rules. Is it just that this was a buggy early implementation, or is there something fundamentally wrong with this idea of taking decision-making and bureaucratic procedures and turning them into code?
I think there's two things. So one, I do think that code, and in this sense, they're called smart contracts, is what they're typically referred to. So it's just code. It says if this happens, make sure this happens. I think that this is kind of a very rigid building block that we should really question whether or not we can build a new set of civic institutions around. I think flexibility and fuzziness, gray areas, tend to be characterized as weaknesses within this community, and we have an underappreciation for the power of interpretability over time and being able to change our minds according to context. So that's one, and I'd love for them to study maybe the Constitution or some other document that's endured over time, and think about principle-driven approach to kind of doing design. The other, though, I think is going back to this issue of diversity, which we talked about a little bit before. I think the folks that are working on this are super duper smart, but they also have a specific toolkit and lack very important kind of perspectives that you really need to have in order to be thinking about the things that they're thinking about. I think Ben and I were talking last night at dinner about I wish he could come to MIT, to talk about some of the ways that elections get gamified or gamed. And I think basic conversations like that would really kind of help this community kind of zoom out and realize what a monumental task it is that they're trying to solve.
I think one of the interesting things here, and I say this cognizant of the fact that I'm sitting next to a former law professor, is that in geek world there is nothing worse than lawyers, right? and the reason that lawyers exist is because laws are ambiguous, and therefore you have to have these messy, mushy humans to somehow interpret them. You're suggesting that mushiness is actually what you need, and that what's tricky is that when you codify this too strictly, things actually get very, very difficult.
They're rigid and they crumble. Yeah.
Right. So, having now put some absolutely fascinating topics on the table, I want to open this up to general conversation. So if we could get some hands up, and I see some in the back, and let's put questions to the panelists. I know we've been with each other all day, but some of us are really bad at names, so if you wouldn't mind just reintroducing yourself when the mic makes its way to you. I am giving this because I'm basically vamping to make it possible for Sonia to get the mics and then bring them up to you all the way up there, and just because dead air seems like a bad thing at this point. Great, let's hand it over to our first questioner.
Yeah, I think you hit it on the head. I think that this idea of harnessing the power of the crowds is a recurring theme you hear a lot, and I think they are drawing from this literature around crowdsourcing. A lot of parallels with biological phenomena that leverage large scale cooperative systems and things like that. So the things they draw from are that systems theory. Folks like Dr. Yuval, I think, who wrote this book named *Sapiens*, is something that gets cited a lot, which is all about what makes the distinguishing factor that makes us human is our ability to do large-scale cooperation. So a lot of people who come from that tradition.
Okay, so the assumption is that you will get a better outcome in terms of the final investment decision by virtue of this process. That's what they're assuming?
I think so, and I think there's that, and then the self-governance is an end in of itself, so it's also just better for us to have collectively governed things. But I think they believe it will also lead to better results. Yeah.
There's one way to sort of understand this emphasis towards decentralization is cases where centralization clearly is problematic. So Facebook is actually a fairly problematic platform for speech. If you happen to be Palestinian and are posting pro-Palestinian things on Facebook, you are almost certain to be reported as hate speech. And this is because there are large organized groups of anti-Palestinian groups who simply flag any pro-Palestinian speech as hate speech. Facebook does not speak Arabic particularly well, nor are they really very interested in reading in great detail the nuances of the different arguments. If 10 people say it's hate speech, it gets taken down and your account gets blocked. Now, Facebook over time is realizing that's not a viable way to go. But interestingly enough, Facebook, by virtue of being the main platform for social discussion for more than 1 billion people, has suddenly become an incredibly powerful gatekeeper of who gets to speak or not. There are people, including people like me, who think that's a really bad thing, and those were in capital letters, and are interested in whether we could build something that is as useful as Facebook, has as much reach as Facebook, but doesn't have that same point of central control and authority. There's 2 problems with this. One, it's really hard. Second of all, there are times where you want governance of one fashion or another. The people who tend to be playing around with things like Bitcoin and Ethereum really want the first and really don't care about the second. They really want decentralization, and they really, really don't want anyone to be able to step in and govern the space. So it becomes a fascinating political science problem on top of a whole bunch of really interesting computer science.
Question for the 3 panelists. It's the question about the cultural problem that is behind the discussion that we're having, and it's the same problem that I have every day when I try to, work on these topics. So there's a cultural or maybe a knowledge problem when it comes to reflect on the critical sides of data activism. So in the case of Stefania, data activism has certainly a big potential, and it's certainly a challenge, but it's seen as either in one way or the other just by few. What I mean with this is my parents do not care anything about the fact that they're always watched, because they say, I don't have anything to hide, and I'm very much prepared to give up any of my information if this serves to catch the bad guys. So, and the young people, on the other hand, they're telling me, for example, my students, that they don't care about being surveilled because it's the price that you have to pay to be public every day. And because I care so much about going public and expressing myself, if they watch me, well, in the end, it's what I'm looking for, to be watched. It doesn't, as long as nothing wrong is committed, there's no violation of any right. Like if privacy wasn't a right in itself, somehow, in 2 different terms, for the older and the younger. For Pedro, the cultural problem, for example, that distinguish the process that in Brazil led to your legislation and in Italy prevented it from becoming legislation and let the Internet Bill of Rights remain simply the product of a commission that involved the private industry, some members of the parliament, and some NGOs or niche intellectuals is a big problem. We don't have a legislation on that. We have a chart that no one knows and no one cares about. And it's there that the human dimension of the internet has remained confined. And so, I mean, how do we move forward an obstacle like that, where the political will to make that a piece of law, so binding liabilities to that, is missing? And for Chelsea, I'm very curious about these experiences. I was wondering, is there any reflection of the fact that centralization is not only something that comes into place when you store the data or you handle the data, but when you start coding, I mean, the fact that, I mean, code is mind product of people who have cognitions and cultural setting and expectation. What it's efficient, what it's the idea of efficiency, and what it's the guarantee that what is efficient for them, it's efficient for me, or will be efficient in Africa, for example, which is not necessarily the same.
Shall we go to Stefania first to respond?
Certainly, it is an emerging phenomenon, and it is definitely by now seen by few who are a little bit more sensitive to certain practices, certain subcultures, and who ask themselves questions, right? So they might share some of the assumptions, let's say the political principles as Chelsea mentioned. Actually, they're pretty much the same people. At the same time, I do see some developments there, and I would like to give myself the next 5 years to see whether it is really going that direction or not. As I said, I don't have empirical data. What I have is a number of, small pilots here and there, going to several crypto parties, for example, in the UK. I've assisted to something that for me was fairly new, is fairly new. I mean, a number of people who have no knowledge whatsoever about, hardly understand what an IP address is, who were there to understand how to encrypt their messages. And what you see is that when you use analog metaphors to understand surveillance of electronic communication, people immediately get it. So it is true. There's I got nothing to hide argument. I mean, I have someone in my team that recently argued that he prefers surveillance to terrorism, and that's something that it's a bit difficult at the surface level to counter argue, right? But I do see some difference, some little changes, in that on the one hand the activists, those that know, want to speak to the others as well, something that they didn't want to do before. And at the same time, I do see like some little evidence here and there of an increased awareness amongst ordinary users. Now, having said that, I was at a conference about a month ago in Canada. I was on media activism, and to my great dismay, there was an entire panel gathering, for example, activists on Black Lives Matter and indigenous rights in Canada, and they were all arguing that Facebook is this great public sphere, and that we can tweak and play around with Facebook and basically ban Facebook to our own needs, like completely dismissing the algorithmic side of the story. So, and these were the activists, right? These are the vanguards of the activists. So we definitely have a problem there, and I would like to see what happens.
Sure. There has been talk about the role that the programmers who are making this code play, and I think there's a deep discomfort with it, but folks don't quite know what to do. So this is definitely, similar to what you've seen in some other movements that really try to be non-hierarchical. Is that like some folks do end up, doing 80% of the leadership work and shaping the direction, but it's all implicit, and nobody, and they're quite uncomfortable with that. I think the interesting side effect of that is that most of the people who are key players building out a lot of this code are hyper-conservative. So inaction tends to be the default if a tough decision needs to be made and we don't have 100% consensus about what to do, which is really hindering, especially the Bitcoin community right now, who's bumping up on some very tough limitations on what their current code can do as more and more people use it. Let me see, I had one more point about that. The other interesting thing I think about this is that most of these guys who are doing these aren't just programmers. Most people come from a security background, which means they have very meticulous methods. They're precision engineers, and so there's a strong urge to be able to be very precise and get things right, so that we can leave it alone and take our hands off of it. And by its very nature, a lot of the things we're doing can't be precision engineered, or else our legal system or whatever would look very different. So I think their solutions right now to this discomfort of leadership is being very conservative and trying to get things right the first time so that we don't have to deliberate on it once it's been done.
Let's take a couple more questions.
Jan Kubik. It is really fantastic, and I think it's very much helping with things we started discussing already in the first panel. But so here's how I see that. So you have the problem. You have two types of solutions. One is, let's give the power of decision making to the code, and particularly your last intervention was very helpful. But then the other two solutions coming from Stefania are different. Then let's not give the power to the code, but let's figure out the better way of organizing people. Power of the crowd, but crowd organized better. But if that is the case, then you are then facing the same set of issues as we discussed in liberal democracy. And the issues are two, right? Liberal democracy is the marriage of participation and accountability, let's put it this way. So the problem of participation, and I wonder if people are thinking about it, is the exclusion. Right, so some people will be included in those communities and some will be excluded, putting aside the digital divide, but maybe there are other barriers, and how are they overcome? I don't know. But the issue that bothers me more is on the side of accountability, because when maybe I do not understand completely, I'm pretty sure I do not, but the way what I'm picking up from what you're saying is there's a massive amount of information, then it needs to be aggregated. So there are aggregators in the system, like in any other system where you have a lot of information or a lot of bits of something, and you have to produce something more coherent, like we talk about the case of political parties, right? Aggregate preferences. So in this process of aggregation, there's a tremendous potential for abuse, of course. And then is there any way to figure out counteracting and protecting people in this process?
I think so. It was interesting connecting with the previous panel, how much we've devoted in the history of political science to understand how rules, concrete rules of a political system will affect the outcome that that we'll have, and how little we've devoted to discuss that on online participation. It's as if we said democracies, because there was this example, of that example, it works or not, right? But this is as broad, right, as what we do when we say online participation doesn't work or works, right? Because the rules that are, the infrastructure of the discussion, right, that creates the environment of discussion would affect completely the outcome. So the first thing I think is to ask what we want from it, right? And I think there are completely different outcomes that will come from different wills that we want from this process. And I think what's for example different, and again getting back to your question, which is what's different from what happened in Brazil to what happened in other countries where there was civil society blocking those movements, is that one thing is we more or less know how to use technology to block things. This is something that works pretty well to put government down even, right? The big challenge is how to use technology to build things, right? How to frame legislation, how to frame policy, how to, not to evaluate. I think to evaluate also we know, right, in terms of government, but in terms of building, this is the piece. But I don't think we are discussing enough how to build infrastructure to build things, right? To create a discussion that will allow us to build things, and not only to block or to avoid or right. So I think that's for me the key of the. And the second part is I think the pleasure of participation. This is also something we haven't invested a lot. And the ability that we have with technology to make participation mean something really enjoyable, funny, and that people would really, and we really don't do that. We really don't use this part of what technology could bring to that. And I think that's a key discussion too, because I think many times discussion on democratic innovation comes to this idea that people just want to participate because they want to get better services. We just had a portfolio review where this was the key of the discussion. And I think we are able to build, to use technology to make democracy something that people want to participate because they enjoy to participate. And definitely I think we're not investing or thinking as much as we should on that.
Stefania, I'd love to.
Yeah, just a small point, because I think you raised a very key issue there, the issue of accountability, and how does it intersect the idea that comes together, let's say the values that go along with with technology, and all these, hacker-minded activists. And in fact, there's, I think, very bad news there. There's no perceived need of accountability. Let's say that very often they want to hold the institution accountable, but they don't have any need to hold themselves accountable. Because there is this sort of widespread notion that we are anyway the good guys, right? And this is problematic. And I see it, for example, I do a lot of work in internet governance as a side activity. So I'm one of those that also, on your behalf, if you're a non-commercial user of the internet, voted on the IANA transition, the proposal that was just recently adopted on the reform of basically the governance on names and numbers for the internet. We are the civil society. We are the good guys. We represent whom? Ourselves. And no one of my colleagues ever wants to raise the issue of accountability on the assumption that we are the good guys. Unless it is written in the system. That's an entirely different story, and it concerns the institution.
It's interesting to think about how we might tie together this panel and the previous one, because in the previous one we had a lot of ways of talking about different voting systems. And in some ways, voting systems are essentially how you let a large number of people make a decision on a common topic. And it turns out that system matters a lot. Who gets to vote, how they get counted, how they sort of end up working. When you run a participatory process, as Pedro did, who gets to participate, how you participate, how those voices are heard, matters a lot. When you try to do this on a blockchain and essentially create a code-based system that a programmer can review and see, this is exactly who gets to participate, these are, it matters enormously who is writing the code. What's interesting in that is that over in Geekland, where Chelsea and I generally live, the assumption is as long as we just publish that and make it highly visible, everyone will find a way to read it and audit it and be fine with it. And of course the answer is, I'm a programmer, but I'm not that good a programmer. I'm not going to go and review the source code for every system that I'm voting on. It's nice to know that maybe someone has. In this case, the someone who did then used it to commit fraud. But no matter what you're doing in any sort of decision-making system, the person or persons building that rule set that decides how many people's different perspectives turn into a decision, that person has enormous power. And that's something that we have to be sensitive to in any sort of democratic system. Chris, I think we'll give you the last question in this so we can stay on calendar.
Just been fascinated by this great panel, and I was just curious about the sort of whether we're using technology to increase deliberation or get rid of it, and that the answer with which of those you want to do may depend on the structure of the decision process. So if you have a small number of people making lots of consequential decisions, you may want to get rid of it because you're worried about the bias and the control. And if you have a large number of people making decisions, you may want to use technology to inform that process and expand it further. But I started my career in the most inefficient deliberative process that somehow in the United States and a small number of other country still gets used, which is jury deliberation on individual criminal cases. Nobody can afford to do it. That's why we have plea bargaining, because the United States can't afford it. Nobody else can afford it either. But it's held out as this huge, iconic cultural good that 12 people would sit around for hours and deliberate on one decision. It's an incredibly wasteful use of democratic time and participation. But I think the discussion has been blurring participation and deliberation, and that's really what I wanted to drill down on. That is, the code allows for lots of participation, but no deliberation. And I think distinguishing which is the good, whether it's deliberation or participation we want, and noticing that these technologies actually break the two apart, is maybe a useful way to begin to think about which direction we want to go in which contexts.
So does anyone want to take up this question of how deliberation sort of happens within these spaces? Stefania, can we maybe go to you first, and then Pedro, and then close with Chelsea?
I'm not sure. I'm intrigued by your question. I'm not sure I have an answer, but let's say that I'm wearing a specific hat, which is the hat of someone who's interested in social movements. I do value participation probably about deliberation, because I believe in the empowering value of it. Now, I don't value, the answer would be different if I was looking at, whatever, outcomes, social movements, so on and so forth. But as someone who's interested in the intersection of technology and what people do with it, I think there's value in participation in itself as well. But I'm not sure I answered your question. It's a very interesting question.
I think first point to answer the question is there is a whole theory that was built in political science. Of course, many here knows it's information organization, which is a big part of how the Congress was built, particularly in the US with the committees, was on the assumption that you needed specialized congressmen in order to deal with the asymmetry of information that we had with the executive and even in society in general. And so the idea is less people will be able to do more deep work that would, and I think that's something that technology can break, right? And then because if you make it less people, it's less participatory, right? Because you have to trust in the honesty of those few who are specialists in energy, right? And the decisions are made there in the committee and not, right? So the point is, I think technology can help us create more participation in order to deliberate, which was something that 20 years ago was absurd, right? So that's one point. And the other point is, I definitely agree that there is a value in participation that can generate deliberation. In terms of and then, of course, that's arguable, but in terms of the legitimacy of the law, I think the question that was heard before, in terms of how do people know about what's happening with the law, if it's not something that is in closed doors, and Chris always used the example of how in New York they've waited to have 50% of people to use the safety belt, and that's it, and then they could pass the law, because then you have. But another way to do it is if you have people convinced that this is a good law by, they say, well, I've participated, or saw, I've heard of the participation. This was, broadcast in some way. And I think that's a question that I think we should face more often too.
Okay. I think I'm a technocrat at heart, so I think I recognize the cost of deliberation, and it is very expensive, and I don't think I believe that every person will make the best decision even for themselves sometimes. So I guess I do agree with this idea of this model of maybe having small groups that do a lot of that heavy lifting for the deliberation part, but the key is really finding ways for them to be accountable and in touch with the people that they're supposed to be making those decisions about. Within this specific community, those things have definitely emerged, it's a small community right now, so the ability, it's a lot of informal accountability holding, and the folks who are doing the heavy lifting of the deliberation are deeply committed to that. But I think as this grows, that will be a growing problem. Yeah, I'll just stop there.
Great. So let's thank the panel one more time.